So Mary, we're just talking about the overall approach of a value government. We note some big ticket items in coalition policy for stamp duty cuts and unspecified commitments around prison building. If funding got tight, what cuts to community services to vulnerable Victorians would you be able to rule out?
We have no plan to cut services to community services at all. Our plan is costed, it's doable within existing budgets while maintaining a small surplus and not taking on any additional debt. So Kim Wells, our Shadow Treasurer, has spent a huge amount of time making sure those numbers work. They'll be released within the next couple of days, as all parties will. And we're very confident that we can run this government in a way that makes sure that we don't have cost overruns, we don't have blowouts, and the money and the commitments that we have made will be absolutely delivered with as higher impact as can be achieved by the commitments.
Thank you. Now we're moving on. Wendy, we're particularly interested here around housing and rental housing. The majority of low-income households live in rental housing, often paying more than 30% of their income on rent. What would a value government do for renters?
I think what we have to realise, Cath, is in this state we have a crisis at all levels of housing. We have a shortage of housing for home ownership. We have a severely restricted private rental market, and that in turn is putting pressure onto the public and community housing sector. And what should be an important safety net, the public housing in this state, is actually a safety net is full of holes and people falling through that into homelessness. So I think what we have to have is a holistic approach to housing in this state, and part of our commitments to halve the stamp duty for first home buyers will assist in making housing more affordable for those in the home ownership market. We also have quite a comprehensive planning policy that is designed to speed up the planning processes, to make sure there's enough land out there that's released to make sure that we can keep up with the demand for housing in the home ownership market. And I think that we're known as the good economic managers, and we will manage the economy better so that we can encourage investment into investment housing that then goes into the private rental market as well. Of course, we realise the importance of continuing to invest in both public housing and community housing, and also to invest in the NRAS scheme, the National Rental Affordability Scheme, that puts houses into the market at only 80% of market rent to assist lower income families to get into private rental. So we're committed to solving the housing crisis in the state and to supporting low income families to make sure that they can be housed with reasonable rents. We've also committed to modernise the Residential Tenancies Act, because there are some problems with that at the moment. It's an act that's 13 years old, and of course normally you would say that the market sets the price, but when you have a failed market, as we have after 11 years of the failed housing policies that we've seen from this government, you also have the need to make sure that that regulatory and legislative framework is right to protect people in the current market. So we'll be having a look at the Residential Tenancies Act with a view to modernising that to make sure that it does provide safety for tenants around things like minimum standards, and also around the section 40, I think it is, of the Act, which allows, well, it prevents people charging more than a month's rent in advance, except if your rent is in excess of $350. Well, how out of date is that? You'd be struggling to find somewhere, particularly in the city, to rent for $350. So whilst when that Act was written, that was at the higher end of the rental market, it's now probably more at the lower end. So there are a few things that need to be looked at in that Act.
And would a value government support the outcomes of the recent parliamentary inquiry into public housing, in particular support for the minimum rental standards that you just mentioned there, and investment in social housing stock to regain the national average of 5%?
Well, I think there's been a number of recommendations from that review, that inquiry, that need to be looked at. And yes, we do only have 3.8% of our housing in Victoria that is community housing, or public and community housing, compared to an average of about 5%. So we need to look at why that is and how we can improve that percentage. We also need to look, I think, at the management practices of housing in this state. And I think housing can be far better managed to ensure that we can house families sooner. What we've seen in this state is over the last 11 years, the average waiting time for people on the early housing waiting list, and as you know, that's people who are at risk of recurring homelessness, has blown out from 2.8 months in 1999 to 8.5 months this year, and that's just an average time. I speak to people all the time who tell me they've got Seg 1, you know, they're on the Seg 1 list, but they're actually being told they'll be waiting up to 4 years. So it does depend in which area you're in, how quickly you can be housed, and also I think, you know, depending on your circumstances as well. So we want to see that that waiting time brought back. But we also know that Victoria has more vacant public housing than any other state, and that was identified in the recent Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report that showed that despite New South Wales having double the amount of public housing that we have here in Victoria, Victoria had more vacant public housing properties at any point in time. The Auditor General has identified not once but twice that the maintenance backlog of the Office of Housing is enormous in this state, and I think with better management practices we can actually turn those vacant properties around sooner, get people housed sooner, and solve their housing problems.
Okay, thank you. Education, next big thing. Martin. So Elizabeth McGarry on behalf of the Inclusive Education Network is asking a question. Many community organisations and countless families are so alarmed by the huge educational barriers still existing for children with additional needs that they're calling for the Victorian Ombudsman to hold an independent inquiry to determine the causes and identify the solutions. So our question is, what would a value government do to ideally avert the need for such an inquiry and respond to this pressing issue?
It's a very broad question because we have students with additional learning needs, physical needs, social needs, and that number just seems to be increasing, even though in our government schools the numbers aren't increasing to a large extent. There's been a huge increase in non-government schools, so I think we've got to look at all children, not just those in government schools. And we feel, as far as the program for students with disabilities, it's just been a band-aid job, and it's not coping with the reality of what is actually happening in our schools now. And we have far more complex cases, an increasing number of children with autism, and there's a whole range of behaviours that they show, and when they come to school, and the social interaction, and we're just not coping with that in schools. And that not only affects them and their teachers, but it does affect the other students in the school as well too. So, and a lot of money that is available in these programs is not actually getting to the child. It's been caught up in the bureaucracy. So we feel there must be better ways of getting that money to the coalface or the chalkface, as we say in education. We need to look at how can we better use the money that's there for a start, and new ways of organising that money, of networking with other schools and other systems, of just getting that money into giving our schools more autonomy. There's some very, very creative solutions that some schools are using, only in their school but also in networks, and it should be the job of the department not to put a blockage there, but actually encourage that and allow schools and networks of schools to actually make better use of the money that is there in the first place. And we've also got a large degree of interest in